The queen asked, "Who created this incredible protective armor?" The human stepped forward. The morning the armor arrived at court, no one was looking at the human. That was how it usually went. Marin Voss had learned, in the 14 months since he'd accepted the residency contract at the Velsorveth Royal Foundry, that the easiest way to move through a sovereignty hall was to stand slightly behind whoever was speaking and keep his expression professionally neutral. He was good at it. He had dark, unremarkable hair, a serviceable build, neither the towering width of the Velsoth Guard Corps nor the wiry elegance of the court artisans who wore their talent the way other people wore jewelry, and hands that gave him away only if someone thought to look, scarred at the knuckles from the fire-shaping frames, stained at the cuticles with the copper-tinged flux he used for the secondary seam treatments, hands that had been working since before he could read a foundry specification. He stood now at the back of the presentation hall and watched the armor being unwrapped. The crate had arrived from the deep workshop at the 7th hour of the morning, carried by 4 of the foundry's transport crew on a reinforced pallet, because the standard 2-person carry had proved insufficient at the loading dock. He'd watched them struggle with it briefly from the workshop window and had made no move to intervene because the pallet was the right call and they'd figured it out. The head chamberlain, a tall Velsoth woman named Oreth Vel, with silver marking lines running from her temples to her jaw in the pattern of the administrative caste, had met the crate personally, which told Marin the queen had been expecting it. Oreth Vel did not personally meet anything she had not been briefed to expect. The wrapping came off in layers. Preservation cloth first, the dense charcoal gray weave they used for high-shine metals that couldn't be exposed to the particulate in ordinary packing material. Then the secondary layer, a softer silver-white fabric, almost translucent, that the foundry used only for commission pieces rated at the highest aesthetic tier. Then the articulated display mount unfolded from the crate's internal frame, the hinged joints locking into a standing position with quiet mechanical precision, and the armor was simply there, suspended in the center of the hall, catching the morning light through the high windows. The hall went quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happened without anyone deciding to make it happen. Marin had heard it before, once, at a ceramics exhibition in the capital of his home district, when a sculptor had unveiled something that made the crowd collectively forget how to breathe. Once at a structural collapse where the last beam had come down, and everyone realized at the same moment that the site was silent. But he had never heard it here, in a hall where court voices ran continuously from the first bell of morning to the last of evening, where the Velsoth conducted the business of a sovereignty, with the particular focused energy of a people who believed loudly in the rightness of their own aesthetic choices. The armor was a full battle set, articulated plate from gorget to greave, every joint engineered for full combat range, rather than the ceremonial restriction that most presentation pieces used because it was easier to make something beautiful that didn't have to function. He had noted the commission's ceremonial context and built a functional piece anyway, because the specifications had described combat requirements, and he built what the specifications described. That was, in his experience, the correct approach. The chest plate was the dominant piece, a compound curve that read, at distance, as a single sweeping form, and revealed, up close, as hundreds of individual scale sections, each one tessellated against its neighbors at the precise angle, required to redirect a blade strike toward the outer edge rather than the center of impact. The geometry had taken him 11 days to work out, not the principle, which he'd understood since his 3rd year of foundry work, but the precise angles as applied to this particular alloy's sheer characteristics under the specific load parameters the commission had specified. He had revised the pattern twice before he was satisfied. He would have revised it a 3rd time if the 2nd revision had not been correct, and he'd known it was correct because the mathematics was clean and the test plates had behaved as predicted. The surface treatment was what people were staring at now. The base metal was Velsoth iron-copper alloy, the standard foundry material for heavy protection work, but Marin had run it through his own secondary process. A flux tempering technique he developed over 3 years of failed attempts on scrapped plates in the rented workshop space above the foundry district, where he'd lived before the residency. And the result was a surface that held the light differently depending on the angle of observation. Head-on, it read as a deep, even bronze. From the side, it shifted into something closer to copper rose. At an oblique angle in strong morning light, it went briefly and astonishingly gold. He'd spent 2 months getting that effect under full control. The first 18 attempts had produced unpredictable results, sometimes beautiful, never reliable. Reliability mattered more to him than beauty, and he had kept working until he understood the mechanism precisely enough that the beauty was predictable and the reliability was absolute. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then, from the corridor that led to the private chambers, there was the sound of a door. Queen Velsora entered without announcement, because she never required announcement in her own hall. She was of middle height for the Velsoth, which put her level with Marin's collarbone, and she wore the plain working attire she used for her morning schedule, a high-collared robe in the dark gray of the administrative house color, with the sovereign mark at the left shoulder in copper thread, a deliberate understatement that most visiting dignitaries failed to decode correctly and court members knew better than to mistake. She had marking lines along her jaw, finer than Oreth Vel's and running in a different pattern, the ruling caste's branching lines, which traced from temple to cheekbone and downward along the throat, and caught the light when she moved in a way that suggested, to Marin's metallurgist eye, a surface that had been worked rather than simply grown. He had studied her face more than was professionally appropriate. He was aware of this. He kept it to the portion of his working life that was technically legitimate, observing the way the marking lines shifted under different light sources when she moved through the foundry tour she conducted twice per season, cataloging the changes the way he cataloged surface behavior on experimental alloys, and he did not think about it outside the foundry. Much. She crossed the hall to the armor and stopped 2 body lengths from it. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Marin counted silently the way he counted cooling intervals. 30 seconds, 45, a full minute in a hall where nobody made a sound. Then Velsora said without turning, "Who created this?" It was not a question, exactly. It had the shape of one but the inflection of a ruler making clear that she expected an answer, and that the answer would be evaluated. The assembled court, chamberlains, artisan guild representatives, 2 of the Queen's personal advisory council, a visiting trade delegation from the eastern provinces, who had been in the hall for a morning meeting on textile tariffs and were now very still in the corner, looked at each other. Oreth Vel, who was the person most entitled to speak, said, "The commission was placed with the Velsorvath Royal Foundry, Your Majesty. The workshop supervisor is." I know where the commission was placed. The Queen had still not turned around. She was looking at the chest plate, at the angle that turned it copper rose, Marin noted from where she was standing. I asked who created it. More silence. The foundry's workshop supervisor, a Velsoth craftsman named Orvath who had 40 years of experience and the confidence that came with it, moved forward from the cluster of foundry staff near the left wall. He was a solid, dignified presence, and his marking lines were the deep blue of the technical artisan caste. "Your Majesty," he said. The piece was produced under the foundry's standard commission process, with contributions from Orvath. Velsora's voice was still level. The secondary flux treatment on this surface has not been produced by any process in the foundry's current catalog. I reviewed the catalog last quarter. The tessellation pattern in the chest plate scales is not the standard foundry pattern. The angular offsets differ by a consistent margin that is not a manufacturing error. The articulation tolerance on the pauldron joints is finer than anything listed in the foundry's last annual review. I have the review. She paused precisely. This piece was made by someone working outside the standard process. I am asking who. Orvath, to his credit, didn't flinch. He was a professional with 4 decades behind him, and he did not flinch. He glanced, just once, a quick professional flicker toward the back of the hall. The trade delegation in the corner had stopped pretending to look at their documents. The guild representatives were very still. Marin put his hands in his pockets, then took them out again, because that read as defensive, and he wasn't defensive. He was simply calculating the geometry of the next several minutes. It was not a complicated calculation. The Queen had read the Foundry's current catalog and the last annual review. She had identified 3 distinct departures from documented process in approximately 45 seconds of observation. She was going to find out regardless of whether he stepped forward, and the only variable was whether it took an hour or an afternoon. He stepped forward. The walk from the back of the hall to the front was approximately 30 meters. It felt, to Marin's proprioception, like significantly more. The court parted around him in the automatic way that crowds parted around things that were moving with purpose, and he was aware, without looking directly at any of them, of the quality of attention he was collecting as he moved. The Chamberlain's assessment, the Advisory Council members' recalibration, the Guild representatives' sharp professional interest shading into something more complicated, the trade delegation's polite confusion. He stopped at a respectful distance from the Queen, far enough that she didn't need to turn her head significantly to see him, and inclined his head in the form the court protocol briefing had specified for a residency-tier contractor addressing a ruling sovereign. "Your Majesty," he said, "the secondary flux treatment is mine. The tessellation pattern is a modification of the standard Foundry geometry, adapted for the specific impact resistance requirements of the Commission specifications. The articulation tolerance is the result of a revised joint fitting process I've been developing for approximately 3 years." Velsora turned. He had not seen her face this close before. The morning tour were conducted at a general group distance. The 2 formal briefings he'd attended had placed him at the back of a presentation room. This was perhaps 4 body lengths, with nothing between them and the hall gone absolutely still. Her eyes were the deep amber that most Velsoth shared, but her irises had an additional ring, pale silver, very fine. That was not universal to the species, and that Marin had noticed on exactly 2 other individuals in his time here, both of them in the ruling house. He did not know if it was genetic or caste marking or simply variation. He noted it now because noting things was what he did when he was buying himself a moment. "You are the human," she said. "Marin Voss, residency contract, Velsorveth Royal Foundry, specialization in ferrous and compound alley forming, 14 months into a 24-month term. I know what you are." She was looking at his hands now, not at his face, but at his hands, the way a metallurgist looked at a sample before committing to an assessment. "I have read your residency intake file." A pause, shorter than the one she'd given the armor. "The surface treatment on this plate, what is the specific process?" Around him, Marin was aware of the quiet taking on a different quality, not the awed silence of the armor's reveal, but the sharp, alert silence of professionals who had a question being answered and wanted to hear the answer. The guild representatives had moved, incrementally, forward. "Flux tempering," he said. "The base alloy is the Foundry's standard iron-copper ratio, run twice through the primary forming process to increase grain density. The secondary treatment uses a modified flux compound, my own formula, not in the Foundry catalog, applied at a specific temperature window during the quench phase. The compound affects the surface oxide layer in a way that alters the light refraction properties of the metal without reducing structural integrity. The visual effect is a function of the crystalline structure of the oxide layer, not a coating. It cannot be scratched or worn off because it is the metal." Velsara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the chest plate, then back at him. "Show me," she said. He had not brought his kit. He had not expected to be demonstrating anything this morning. He had expected to stand at the back of the hall and watch the presentation, and then return to the deep workshop where he had 3 commission pieces in various stages of progress, and a 4th that was giving him trouble at the Pauldron-Gorget articulation. The Pauldron problem had been occupying approximately 40% of his available processing for 3 days, and he had been hoping the presentation would free him to return to it by mid-morning. But one of the Foundry's junior staff, a young Velsoth woman named Seelith, who had served as Marin's unofficial liaison with the Foundry administration since his 2nd week, and who seemed to have anticipated the present situation better than he had, appeared at his elbow with his kit bag within 4 minutes of the Queen's instruction, breathing only slightly harder than normal. He thanked her quietly. She gave him the look she reserved for moments when he did something she found inexplicably characteristic of humans, a fine crease between her marking lines that he had come to read as fond exasperation, though he was not entirely certain that was the correct translation, and had been meaning to ask her about it for 11 months. The demonstration took place in the hall's secondary examination space, an antechamber off the main room, equipped with the kind of lighting rig that the court used for quality assessment of presentation pieces. The Queen did not go back to her private chambers. She stayed. The guild representatives stayed. All 4 of them, which was not nothing. Velsoth Artisan Guild representatives were not people who invested their time in things they did not consider professionally significant. Marin noted this and filed it. Oreth Vel stayed, with the expression of someone conducting a rapid professional reassessment in real time. The advisory council member who had been standing near the central display, an older Velsoth man whose marking lines had the complex layered pattern of someone with multiple caste designations, moved to a position at the room's edge and watched from there. Marin set up the demonstration on a workbench a junior staff member produced from somewhere, a prepared sample plate, 2 inches square, carrying the same secondary treatment as the armor. He ran through the process in stages, explaining the flux compound's composition, the specific ratios, the temperature sensitivity, the quench timing, and demonstrated the light refraction effect under the examination rig from multiple angles. He was good at this part. He was better at the making than the explaining, but 14 months of Foundry residency had given him practice, and he knew how to pitch an explanation to an audience that had the technical vocabulary but not the specific experiential knowledge. He kept his explanations precise and linear, cause, mechanism, result in that order, with the evidence at each stage, and he watched the Queen's face while he talked, the way he watched a piece while it was forming, for the moment when the material revealed its actual properties rather than its expected ones. She had questions. This did not surprise him. It surprised the chamberlains from the looks he could see at the edge of his peripheral vision, but it did not surprise him. The commission specification she'd submitted, delivered through 3 layers of administrative intermediary, as was standard for a royal commission, had been unusually precise. She had specified the impact resistance requirements not in the general terms that most commission clients used, but in the exact load parameters the material would need to withstand, with reference to the specific combat scenarios for which the piece was intended. He had read those specifications 3 times before beginning the design, and had revised the tessellation geometry twice to properly address them. Someone had written those specifications who knew what they were actually asking for. He answered her questions. She asked about the longevity of the flux treatment under sustained impact exposure. He gave her the test data, which she received with a small nod that suggested she was filing it rather than accepting it on trust. She asked about the articulation tolerance margins, and whether the joints would maintain their rated range of motion after repeated flexion cycles at combat velocity. He explained the revised joint fitting process, the specific changes from the foundry's standard method, the field testing he'd conducted using a kinematic simulation rig he'd built in the rented workshop space the previous year. She asked about the alloy's thermal behavior under the flux treatment, which was a question that indicated she understood the physics of oxide layer formation, and he answered it in full. Then she asked whether the compound formula was proprietary, and what the replication timeline would be for matching pieces. That last question made several of the guild representatives exchange a look. Marin filed the look and answered the question. Yes, the formula was currently proprietary to his own development process. Replication would require his direct involvement at the flux preparation stage, until the foundry's technical staff had time to work through the tolerance parameters on their own equipment, which he estimated at approximately 6 weeks of supervised trial work. 6 weeks, the Queen said. For a competent foundry crew working with the right equipment, yes. The Velsorvath foundry's technical staff is competent. The equipment is present. The variable is the operator-specific calibration at the quench phase, which I can document in detail, but which benefits from supervised practice runs. You would remain for 6 weeks beyond your current residency schedule. If that's a question about my availability, I'm available. If it's a question about whether the residency contract covers the work, that would need to go through the foundry administration. He paused, and then said, because it was accurate and because he had learned in 14 months that the Queen's court valued precision over diplomatic imprecision, I would prefer to stay for the 6 weeks. I have been working on this process for 3 years. The Velsorvath foundry has the best heavy forming equipment I have encountered in any posting. It would be professionally useful to me to see the process fully established here before I leave. Something in the Queen's expression shifted. It was not a large shift. Velsoth expressions were, in his experience, more contained than his own species' default register. But he had been watching her face through 30 minutes of technical demonstration, and he caught it. A fractional relaxation around the eyes, a slight adjustment of the marking lines at her jaw that indicated, he believed, based on his 14 months of observation, though he held the belief provisionally, some internal recalibration. The presentation armor, she said. The commission was intended as a formal gift to the Southern Garrison's commanding officer at the upcoming Accord ceremony. Yes. The commission spec made that clear. You made a full field-rated piece, when a ceremonial grade would have satisfied the contract. Marin looked at her for a moment. The commission specifications described combat requirements, he said. I built what the specifications described. Another small silence, different in quality from the earlier ones. The Southern Garrison's commanding officer is my third-year marshal, Velsora said. She is 31 years old and has been in active command operations for 8 of them. She will be wearing that armor in the field, not on a ceremonial stand. Then it should function in the field, Marin said. That seemed obvious from the specifications. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. Then, and this was the thing he would think about later, in the deep workshop, with the half-finished pauldron in his hands, and the quiet that he worked best in, she looked at the sample plate still sitting on the workbench, the 2-inch square of metal that had gone copper-rose under the examination rig at the angle. The morning light came in from the antechamber's east window. Leave that, she said, and the words were addressed to the room generally, which meant they were addressed to him specifically. I will see you in the foundry tomorrow at the first bell. We will discuss the 6-week schedule. Then she turned and walked back through the antechamber to the main hall, and the court moved with her the way a tide moved, and the guild representatives followed with their exchanged looks, which had shifted, over the course of the demonstration, from sharp interest into something that Marin categorized, provisionally, as professional engagement. And Oreth Vel gave Marin a look of her own as she passed, appraising, not unkind, carrying the specific weight of someone who had updated a significant data point. Then he was standing in the secondary examination space with Seelith and the sample plate, and the light coming in at copper rose angles. "Well," Seelith said. "Yes," Marin said. He picked up the sample plate and put it in his kit bag and went back to the deep workshop to work on the pauldron problem, because the day was still young and the problem was still there. He was at the foundry at the first bell the next morning because he was always at the foundry at the first bell. The deep workshop had the particular quality of early morning silence that he liked best, the fire-shaping frames cooling from the previous day's work, the air carrying the residual mineral smell of flux and metal, the bench surfaces cleared and ready. He had 3 active commissions in various stages and the pauldron problem to resolve, and he sat with his notes and the problem for an hour before the foundry began to fill with its usual morning activity. He had not solved the pauldron problem. He had thought about it from 4 different angles, and the error was not presenting itself, which meant it was either a very small error or he was looking in the wrong place. Both possibilities were equally annoying. The Queen arrived at the second bell. She came with Orath Vel and a single aide, no guard corps, no court entourage, the minimum formal attendance for a sovereign's foundry visit, and she walked directly through the public workshop to the deep workshop corridor without stopping at the administration desk. Seelith, who had been watching the entrance, appeared at Marin's bench 17 seconds before the Queen's footsteps reached the deep workshop door, which told him Seelith had been watching since the first bell. He stood when the Queen entered. The workshop was his domain, but she was a sovereign, and the protocol was unambiguous on this point. "Sit," she said, which was a more direct instruction than he'd expected. He sat. She did not sit. She stood at the edge of the workbench and looked at the pieces in progress, the 3 commissions, the pauldron problem, the rack of sample plates from the flux tempering trial work he'd been running in parallel for the past 6 weeks. She looked at them the way she'd looked at the armor in the hall, with the unhurried attention of someone who was learning something and knew they were learning something. Not the attention of someone performing interest, which he had encountered before in official contexts and found difficult to work around. The real thing. He had learned in 14 months to recognize the distinction. "The pauldron," she said after a while. "Articulation problem. The joint-fitting radius at the gorget connection is giving me a flex restriction I can't account for in the design geometry. I've been through the specifications twice, and I can't find where the error is entering." She leaned over the workbench, close enough that he was aware of the specific quality of her presence, the way you were aware of a heat source in a room, and looked at the pauldron pieces laid out in their assembly order. She was quiet for a moment. Her marking lines were copper rose in the deep workshop's firelight, which was not an observation that was professionally relevant and which he made anyway because that was, apparently, what he did. "The mounting bracket," she said, "the angle." He looked at it. He had looked at it 40 times. He looked at it again now with the specific new perspective of someone standing beside him at the bench, someone who had looked at the bracket from slightly to his left and 3 inches lower, at a different angle than any angle he'd examined. "The angle is half a degree off the specification," he said slowly. "On the bracket, not on the joint." "The joint flexes to the bracket," Velsora said, "not to the design. If the bracket is not at specification, the joint inherits the error." He held the bracket under the bench light and measured the angle, half a degree exactly. He had been solving the wrong component for 3 days. The joint was correct. The bracket he had fitted by hand and not measured because he had fitted it 50 times on other pieces and trusted the calibration, had drifted half a degree during the attachment, and he had not caught it because he had been looking at the joint. He set the bracket down and looked at the Queen for a moment. She was watching him with the expression he had come to think of as her default working expression, neutral, attentive, evaluating without committing to an evaluation, and there was something underneath it that he didn't have a category for yet. "You know foundry work," he said. "I know armoring," she said, My mother considered it a sovereign's necessary competency. She said that a ruler who could not evaluate the quality of her own military equipment was at the mercy of whoever made the evaluation for her. A pause, brief and even. She applied this principle to everything she considered strategically significant. I inherited the habit. A practical perspective. She was a practical woman. The almost warmth in her voice when she said it was not something she put there deliberately, he thought. It arrived the way flux behavior arrived, as a function of the material's actual properties rather than an applied surface. She did not anticipate that the Royal Foundry's most technically interesting current project would be a human residency contractor's proprietary flux process, but she would have approved of following the technical interest wherever it led. Marin looked at the bracket in his hand. Is that what this is? You made an exceptionally well-engineered piece of defensive equipment for a 31-year-old field marshal who was going to be wearing it in the field, Velsora said. Because the specifications described combat requirements, and you built what the specifications described. I want to understand your process. She paused again, and the pause had a different quality than her professional ones, shorter, lighter. The way the pause before an unexpected result felt different from the pause before a predicted one. That is technical interest, among other things. Among other things. He filed that, carefully, in the same mental space where he filed observations he needed to think about before he knew how to categorize them. The space had been accumulating entries for approximately 12 of his 14 months at the foundry. That night, alone in the residency quarters 2 streets from the foundry, Marin reviewed the day with the same methodical attention he applied to trial data. He did this not from anxiety but from habit, the habit of a person who had made a practice, over many years, of understanding what had actually happened in a room rather than what he'd expected to happen. What had actually happened? A queen who had read the Foundry's catalog and its last annual review had asked a question whose answer required him to step forward, in a court full of people who were very good at not stepping forward. He had stepped forward. She had asked him to demonstrate the process. He had demonstrated it. She had asked questions that suggested a structural understanding of the physics involved, and she had asked him to remain for 6 weeks beyond his current schedule. What he was still working out. The precise quality of the attention she had given him during the demonstration. He had, in 14 months, observed the Queen at 2 foundry tour and 2 formal briefings. He had a data set. He could characterize from that data set her professional attention as applied to technical content. What he had seen during the demonstration had more dimensions than he'd previously cataloged. He filed this under the category of things that required more observation before a conclusion was appropriate, and went to sleep. The 6-week program began the following day. 3 senior flux technicians, Verak, Seln, and Dora Ash, the last being a recent promotion to the senior level and still working out the confidence that went with the title. All experienced, all initially cautious with the welcome wariness of professionals who had been doing good work for a long time and wanted to understand why they were being asked to modify their process. Marin had expected that. He had prepared for it the way he prepared for any technically collaborative work, with documentation, with demonstration, with the patience to let the material speak for itself, and the people working with it come to their own understanding. The Queen attended the first session. She attended the second as well. She arrived partway through and stood at the observation position he'd set up for the foundry administrator at the room's edge, and asked no questions during the session itself, and afterward asked 2. One about the quench timing tolerance margin at low ambient temperature, and one about the compound's behavior in a humidity variable environment. Both were questions the 3 technicians had not asked, and that Marin had been thinking about. He gave her the current answers, preliminary, based on the trial data, and noted that the humidity variable was something he needed to investigate more systematically. "I'll add it to the documentation agenda," he said. The eastern provinces have variable humidity across the seasonal cycle, she said. The Garrison Commission is in the Eastern Territories. I know. The specifications noted the deployment environment. I flagged it in my trial notes as a secondary investigation point. She looked at the trial notes he gestured toward, a stack of handwritten pages in the format he used for working documentation, which was not, he was aware, either neat or conventionally organized, but which was legible to him and to the technicians who had been working with it for 2 weeks. She did not reach for them. She looked at them from the appropriate distance and said, "When you have the humidity investigation data, I would like to see it." "Yes, Your Majesty." By the 4th session, when Varric had successfully reproduced the light refraction effect on his 3rd attempt, and was looking at the result with the expression of a professional who had just understood something structural, the Queen was asking questions alongside Marin's questions, and the distinction between who was conducting the session and who was attending it had become, practically speaking, unclear. He had not decided when this shift happened. He reviewed his memory of the sessions and concluded it had happened at some point during the 3rd session, which had run 40 minutes past its scheduled close and which he had not noticed ending because the conversation had not stopped. The guild representatives appeared on the 5th session and were given observation positions at the room's edge. Marin watched them watch the trial work and noted the professional attention in their expressions, not the skeptical attention of people evaluating an outsider's claim, which was what he'd expected, but the sharper and more interested attention of craftspeople who had recognized that something new was being demonstrated and wanted to understand it fully. After the session, the senior guild representative, a woman named Keth Vell, with the complex marking lines of the artisan caste senior tier, approached Marin at the workbench and asked 3 questions about the compound's application in non-armoring metalwork. He answered them. She listened with the focused quality of someone building a structural understanding rather than collecting facts. Then she said, in the direct manner of the Velsoth technical guilds, "Your documentation, is it available for review?" "After the program completes," he said. "When the Foundry's technical file is closed, yes." "I will put in a formal request," she said, which was, in Velsoth guild culture, not a request but a statement of intention. The advisory council member who had been in the hall for the armor presentation appeared briefly at the 6th session and left again after 40 minutes. Marin did not know what conclusions he had drawn and filed the uncertainty. He worked. The commissions progressed. The pauldron problem resolved cleanly once the bracket angle was corrected, a fact that gave him disproportionate satisfaction because it had been irritating him for 3 days, and the resolution was neat and required only the replacement of one component, and the flux tempering program developed at the rate he'd estimated, with the Foundry's technical staff absorbing the process faster than the 6-week projection because they were, as he'd said, competent. He began revision work on the tessellation geometry documentation, translating his field engineering notes into the formal specification format the Foundry's archive required. He started thinking about a secondary application for the flux compound in the joint treatment for structural rather than armored pieces, which was a different engineering problem, and one he hadn't expected to encounter, and which occupied the portion of his available processing that was not actively engaged on the current commissions. He was in the deep workshop one evening, well past the Foundry's standard close, the workshop empty except for the slow-cooling frames and the residual warmth, when he became aware that the Queen was in the corridor. Not from sound, he couldn't have explained it precisely. He had a proprioceptive sense of the deep workshop's usual evening conditions, the specific way the air moved when a heat source was active or cooling, the quality of light from the corridor that changed depending on how many of the building's after-hours lamps were still lit, and whether any of them were being interrupted. What he noticed was a variation in the corridor light that was consistent with the presence of someone standing in the doorway, and the absence of the footstep sounds that would have accompanied anyone from the foundry's regular evening staff. He looked up from the bench. Velsara was in the doorway. She had removed the sovereign mark robe, wearing plainclothes, a dark shirt and working trousers that looked as though she might have changed from the court's evening schedule, a level of informality he had not seen from her before. No aide, no Orath Vel, the minimum attendance of a person who had decided to go somewhere without an official reason for going and had simply gone. Her marking lines were very dark in the low light. She was looking at the piece he was working on, a preliminary sample for the structural flux application, nothing to look at yet, with the quiet attention she gave things that were not finished but might become interesting. "You are here late," she said. "I generally am. The evening quiet is good for focused work." He paused. "Your Majesty, the additional protocol is unnecessary when we are the only people in the building," she said, crossing the threshold. She came to the bench and looked at the sample plate he was working on, with the flux compound half applied and the surface treatment at the stage that looked, to the uninformed eye, like a mess. To the informed eye it looked like a beginning. He was fairly certain she was looking at it with the informed eye. "What is this for?" "Structural application. The flux compound may have properties useful for joint treatment in architectural metalwork. I've been thinking about it since the 4th session, when Varek asked about the compound's behavior under sustained load rather than impact." He set down his tool. "It's preliminary. I haven't done the load calculations yet." "But you're thinking about it." "I'm always thinking about several things." She was quiet for a moment, standing at the bench, looking at the sample plate, and the workshop held the kind of quiet that felt, to Marin, less empty than it usually did. He was aware of her in the specific way that he had been aware of her marking lines in firelight and the copper rose shift in morning examination light, as a thing he had been observing carefully, and was now observing from a much closer distance than he usually permitted himself. "You will finish the 6-week program in 11 days, she said. "Yes. And your residency contract has 10 months remaining." "Yes. There is a foundry commission for the eastern wall restoration work. The structural metal work on the joining sections. It has been in the queue for 4 months because the material specification is complex, and the foundry has not had a contractor with the specific expertise to address it properly." She looked at the sample plate again, and the piece he was developing on the bench beside it. The specification involves sustained load join requirements in a historically constructed wall, with 4 generations of repair work at varying material standards. Marin was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about the load distribution problem in a wall built across 4 different material eras, and what that did to the join behavior when the ambient conditions changed. "I would need to see the site assessment before I could commit to a methodology," he said. "Of course. And the historical repair records. If there are 4 generations of work, the material interfaces are going to have inconsistent behavior under load, and I need to know where each generation's work ends and the next begins." "The records are in the Sovereignty Archive," she said. "Orath Vel has the access inventory." "Then yes," he said, "the commission would be of professional interest." He looked at the preliminary sample, the half-applied compound, the undeveloped surface, the beginning of something he didn't fully understand yet. "I would prefer to stay, both for the work." And he said this carefully, because it was accurate, and because he had been thinking about accuracy for 11 months, because the work here has been better than any other posting I've had. She looked at him. The pale silver ring in her irises was very clear in the low light. "I had read your intake file before the armor presentation," she said. "I have read it more carefully since." "I know," he said. "Orath Vel mentioned the commission inquiry was being tracked at the sovereign review level. That is not standard for residency tier contractors." A small pause. "No," she said, "it is not." They looked at each other in the deep workshop, with the cooling frames and the half-made things and the evening quiet. "The 6-week program," he said. "I should finish the documentation before we start discussing extensions." "Yes," she said, and there was the almost warmth again, the thing that arrived without being placed. "That seems practical." "I'm a practical person," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have noticed," and left the workshop and left him with the sample plate and the beginning of something he didn't have a category for yet, which was, he thought, probably the accurate description. The accord ceremony took place at the end of the 3rd month. The armor traveled south with the ceremony delegation and came back, a week later, with a dispatch from the 3rd-year marshal, a single handwritten line on the official correspondence paper addressed to the Velsorvath Royal Foundry that said, "The piece functions as stated. I have worn it in 3 field conditions. Whoever made the tessellation understood load distribution. Please pass my compliments." Marin read the line twice, alone in the deep workshop, and felt the particular satisfaction of a piece functioning the way it was supposed to function in the conditions it was built for. He tacked the dispatch to the corkboard above his bench, between the flux compound formula notes and the preliminary calculations for the Eastern Wall project. Seelith saw it on her morning rounds and said nothing, only gave him the fine crease look, which meant she understood what it represented and considered it characteristic. He had been working on the Eastern Wall structural assessment for 2 weeks by that point, the commission having been formally expanded through the Foundry administration with a speed that told him the paperwork had been prepared in advance of his agreement. He was spending 3 days a week at the wall site, an old structure, pre-sovereignty, with the particular engineering problems of historical metalwork that had been repaired by 4 successive generations of craftsmen with 4 successive sets of priorities, and 3 days at the foundry bench, and 1 day sorting through the accumulated technical documentation he was generating at a rate that would, he calculated, require approximately another 6 months to properly organize. The Queen was in the foundry twice per week. This had become, over the course of the previous 2 months, unremarkable. She came in the late morning, worked through technical questions with the flux program's continuing development for 2 hours, and left at mid-afternoon. On 3 occasions, she had extended the session into the evening. On 2 of those occasions, she had eaten from the foundry's tray service with him and Seelith, and the remaining junior staff, rather than returning to the palace for the formal dinner schedule, sitting at the end of the workbench with a tray and asking questions about the wall assessment documentation, and making notes in a small book she kept in her coat pocket. Oreth Vel had come to the foundry on one of those evenings and looked at the informal dinner arrangement. The Queen at the end of the workbench, Marin on his stool across from her with the assessment notes between them, Seelith at the equipment rack pretending to catalog things, and the expression on Oreth Vel's face was one Marin had not seen from her before, something between evaluation and something he could not precisely categorize, which was happening more often in his recent observations. He was honest with himself about a number of things. He had been careful, in his 14 months at the Velsorvath Foundry, not to read anything into the Queen's professional attention beyond its professional content, because he was a residency contractor from off-world and she was a sovereign, and the geometry of that situation was not ambiguous. He had watched her marking lines in firelight and her eyes in examination light, and the way she looked at pieces that were not finished but might become interesting, and he had kept those observations in the part of his mind that noted things without acting on them, which was a disciplined and professionally appropriate position to maintain. He maintained it, mostly. He maintained it in the sense that he did not act on it, which was the operative criterion. He was, he acknowledged privately, less rigorous about the observing. On the evening she came to the foundry and found him working on the wall assessment and stayed through the bell that marked the end of the working day, and then the next bell, and they were still at the bench at what should have been the hour he went home. She said, The accord ceremony documentation referenced the armor twice in the formal record. The material specification has been requested by 3 visiting delegations since the ceremony. I heard from Orvath, he said. He forwarded the inquiries. The Foundry intends to list the process in the next annual review. The administrator asked me whether there were any objections to the formal listing. None from me. The listing will name the process. She looked at him steadily. There was a discussion about attribution. The Foundry developed it into something reproducible, he said. That's the actual product. My preliminary work was 3 years of trial work in a rented workshop above a Foundry district, she said, before you were contracted to a facility with the equipment to properly support the process. Yes. The listing will include the attribution, she said. I told the administrator this was not negotiable. A pause and then, very quietly, you built the armor because the specifications described combat requirements, and you built what the specifications described. You did not ask whether it exceeded the contract scope. You did not charge for the additional work. She paused again. You have a habit, she said, of giving everything you can to a thing you are making and considering the extra cost part of the cost of making it correctly. He was quiet for a moment. I was taught that way, he said. My first Foundry master. She said the difference between a craftsman and a contractor was whether you made what the job required or what the client specified. The two were often the same. When they weren't, a craftsman made what the job required. Velsora looked at him for a long time. She was right, she said. The armor is what it is because of that principle applied by the specific person you are. The workshop was very still. I want you to stay, she said. Not only for the wall commission. That is, separately, also true, but it is not the primary thing I am saying. He looked at her, at the marking lines and the pale silver in her irises, and the 7 months of careful, mutual observation that had arrived at this moment from 2 directions simultaneously. I have been thinking about how to say this accurately, he said, for approximately 11 months. Something in her expression arrived without being placed, the warmth, the real one, without the professional surface over it. And the accurate thing, he said, is that I have not, in 14 months of working here, encountered anything I wanted to leave. That includes the work, and it includes the Foundry, and it includes the conversations in the evening after the formal schedule ends. That is the accurate thing. She was very close. The workshop held the cooling frame quiet and the low light and the half-made things. Then stay, she said simply. Yes, he said. The Eastern Wall Commission took 7 months. The flux tempering program was fully established in the Foundry by the end of the 4th month, the process documented, and the technical staff certified. The structural application he had begun theorizing about proved out in the field testing. The compound's behavior in a historically layered join was different from its armor plate behavior in ways that were interesting, and that took him 3 months and 2 consultation sessions with a structural engineer from the Sovereignty's Civil Works Division to fully characterize, and was added to the Commission's material scope. His residency contract expired at the end of the 7th month. The Foundry administrator presented the contract renewal paperwork at the morning meeting on the 43rd day of the 8th month. Marin read it at his bench, with the copper rose light from the deep workshop's high windows and Seelith standing at his peripheral vision, pretending to organize equipment. The contract was a senior staff position, a permanent appointment, not a residency term, with the Foundry title of Master Formwright and a set of technical responsibilities that encompass the Flux program's ongoing development, the structural applications work, and consultation rights on all Sovereign Commission pieces rated at the highest aesthetic tier. He read it once. He read it again. He read the addendum at the back, which was not standard Foundry contract language and which bore the sovereign mark at the left margin. It said, In the direct and precise phrasing he had come to recognize as hers. The Velsorveth foundry's technical standing depends on its capacity for ongoing development. The person most qualified to ensure that capacity is the person currently in residence. The foundry administration has made the appropriate offer. I have made a different one which is noted here for the record. I would like you to stay. This is not an instruction. V.S. He held the contract for a while. The deep workshop held its morning quiet around him, and the frames held their cooling heat, and outside the high windows the Velsorveth morning was doing what it did with the light. "Sealeth," he said. "Yes," she said, not turning from the equipment rack. "Where is the foundry administrator's office?" "Fourth corridor's second door." "And after that," he said, "where is the sovereign's morning schedule held?" A pause. Then the fine creased look over her shoulder, which this time was not fond exasperation but something different, something that he found on examination looked very much like relief, and possibly, he thought, had been there waiting to express itself for a number of months. "The small study off the gallery," she said. "She'll be there until the second bell." He signed the contract first. Then he walked to the fourth corridor, second door, and handed it to the foundry administrator, who received it with the professional composure of someone who had been expecting this outcome, and had the grace not to show how much she'd been hoping for it. Then he walked to the gallery. The small study's door was open. Velsara was at a standing desk, working through a stack of documents, her back to the door. The morning light from the gallery windows came through the study's connecting arch at the angle that made her marking lines look like fine copper wire traced along her jaw. He had been noting that angle in different rooms and different lights for 8 months. He knocked on the open door. She turned. He said, "I read the addendum." She looked at him for a moment. The unhurried assessment, the evaluating attention that had given him, over many months, the full picture of a person who thought carefully before she spoke and meant precisely what she said when she said it. "And," she said, "I signed the contract." The foundry appointment. He looked at her, at the marking lines and the morning light and the pale silver in her irises that he had been noting for 8 months without a category for it. And then he said, because it was accurate and because accuracy mattered more to him than most other things. "The different offer in the addendum. I wanted to say directly that I want to stay, both for the work and for the reasons that are not the work. That is the accurate statement." She held his gaze for a long moment, with the expression that was not the professional neutral and not the evaluating attention but the third thing, the one he thought of as the real register, the one that arrived without being placed. Then she said, "A practical answer." "I'm a practical person." "I know," she said, and the warmth in it was the real warmth, the one that had been arriving in the evenings for months, and she crossed the study and stood in front of him, which was 4 steps and which felt like the geometry resolving after a long calculation. The answer the problem had contained all along, visible only when you stopped looking in the wrong place. "The eastern wall," she said. "Phase 2 begins next spring. I've seen the preliminary scope. It's going to be more complicated than Phase 1. "Yes." The lightness in her voice now, the almost smile, the thing that arrived when she found something unexpectedly right, was something he had learned to recognize the way he learned to recognize surface behaviors in new alloys, by watching it closely enough to know it when it came. "I would not want to approach it without access to someone who understands the geometry." "Then it's fortunate," he said, "that I'm staying." She was very close. The morning held the gallery light, and the study quiet, and the 8 months of observation arriving at its conclusion, in the clear way conclusions arrived when the work was done correctly. "Yes," she said. "It is." And then, because she was a practical woman who had learned the habit from her mother, who had believed in following the technical interest wherever it led, she closed the remaining distance herself. The second dispatch from the Southern Marshal arrived 14 months later, on a morning when Marin was in the deep workshop with the Phase 2 wall documentation and the specific problem of a historically compromised eastern buttress join that had been keeping him company for 2 weeks. It said, "The first set has held through 20 field conditions without failure. I am retiring it to the garrison display in the spring. Please advise on a second commission. My specifications will be more detailed this time. I have 11 months of field data on load conditions." He read it twice. Then he set it on the bench beside the first dispatch, which was still tacked to the corkboard and had acquired, in 14 months, the faded quality of a working document that had been consulted many times. 2 pieces of evidence for a conclusion he had confirmed to his own satisfaction long since, that a thing built to specification, by a person who understood what the specification actually required, would do what it was made to do. He wrote a reply to the marshal about the commission process and the documentation she'd need to submit, and set it in the outgoing tray, and went back to the buttress problem. Later, when the morning schedule ended and Velsara came through the deep workshop corridor, not in the formal robe now, or only when the occasion specifically required it, with the same quiet presence she'd had the first evening she'd appeared in the doorway with the low light making her marking lines dark, she leaned over the bench and looked at the buttress diagrams and said, in the direct way that was her working register, "You found it." An hour ago. He showed her the join geometry, the specific point where the third generation of repair work had created a load transfer problem that the fourth generation had compensated for incorrectly. The fix is a secondary brace here, at the original material's shear boundary. 2 weeks of work if the weather holds. She looked at the diagram for a moment, then at him. "The Southern Marshal sent a second commission request," she said. "Orath Vel forwarded it to the foundry." "I know. I received the dispatch this morning." He looked at the buttress geometry and at the margin notes he'd been building for 2 weeks. "The specifications will need to address the humidity variable across the seasonal cycle. I have data on that now." "Good," she said, and the warmth in it was the one that arrived without being placed, the one that had been arriving consistently for 14 months, and that he had, by now, a complete taxonomy for. Outside, through the high windows, the Velsorveth morning came in at its copper-rose angle. He noted it. He had stopped filing it separately. It had become simply part of the conditions in the deep workshop, the quality of light that meant a particular time of day and a particular person, and the work that was always there waiting. He went back to the problem. She stayed and looked at the wall diagrams, and made notes in the small book she kept in her coat pocket, and asked 2 questions about the buttress brace geometry that were the right questions, and the workshop held the morning quiet around them both. This, Marin Voss thought, was what the specifications had described. He had simply built what the specifications described. He always did.